The crack of splintering cedar hit me before I even killed the engine. Then came the low growl of a skid steer. Then the sharp smell of fresh-cut lumber mixed with lake water and diesel exhaust. I rounded the last bend of my gravel drive, and for one long second my brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. My lake fence, the one my father and I had rebuilt board by board after a spring flood 15 years ago, lay in broken piles across the shoreline. A yellow excavator sat where my gate had been. Orange construction fencing stretched across my grass, and a crew in bright safety vests was unloading dock sections directly onto my property. Hey, I slammed my truck door hard enough to echo across the water. Who authorized this? The operator lifted his hands off the controls, looking more confused than guilty. A foreman in a white hard hat walked toward me holding a clipboard. You Ethan Caldwell? I own this land. He glanced at the paperwork. We've got authorization from Willow Cove HOA. Community Marina expansion. Community Marina. The words tasted wrong. I looked beyond him toward the lake. The marina I'd grown up beside sat 200 yards away, tucked into its own protected cove. Now temporary floating docks reached farther along the shoreline than I'd ever seen, and workers were staking out new slips almost to the edge of my dock. Someone had painted fluorescent survey marks across my grass. Boot prints covered the flower beds Laura planted every spring. And where my cedar fence used to run beside the narrow gravel lane leading toward the marina, there was nothing but churned dirt. I felt something tighten in my chest. Not panic. Recognition. Someone had decided this was already theirs. The unmistakable click of expensive heels on gravel interrupted my thoughts. Victoria Ashcroft stepped out of a white Range Rover wearing pressed linen slacks that somehow looked untouched by the dust blowing across the construction site. She smiled before she spoke. Not because she was happy, because she thought the conversation was already over. Ethan, she called. I was hoping we'd catch you before you filed a complaint. I stared at her. You tore down my fence. It wasn't your fence anymore. She said it as casually as someone commenting on the weather. The HOA board voted unanimously to restore community access to the waterfront. My waterfront. She folded her arms. The subdivision plat is very clear. This shoreline has always been intended as common recreational property. Frankly, your fence never should have been there. My father's name flashed through my mind before I even realized why. Frank Caldwell had measured every post himself. He used to joke that fences weren't built to keep honest people out. They remind dishonest people where they should stop. I walked past Victoria without another word. Every few feet, I stopped to photograph something. Broken fence rails. Fresh tire tracks. The excavator sitting halfway across my lawn. The scraped earth where the fence posts had been pulled out. Then something caught my eye. About 30 feet inland, hidden beneath a patch of tall, ornamental grass Laura had never wanted to trim too short, an old square concrete post still stood untouched. Weathered. Cracked. Easy to mistake for landscaping. Most people wouldn't have looked twice. I did. Dad always refused to remove those ugly old markers, no matter how many neighbors suggested replacing them. They're staying, he'd tell me. Someday you'll understand. Victoria noticed where I was looking. They're just old concrete stumps, she said with a dismissive laugh. The contractors figured they weren't worth hauling away. I simply took another photograph. Then another. The foreman shifted uneasily. Ma'am, he said quietly. Should we keep unloading? Victoria never took her eyes off me. Absolutely. The rumble of another flatbed truck rolled down the narrow gravel lane that crossed the edge of my property before reaching the marina. Workers waved it forward. Fuel tanks. Dock pilings. Lumber. Every vehicle entered exactly the same way. Across that strip of land. I watched each truck pass without saying a word. Victoria mistook my silence for surrender. You'll receive reimbursement for the old fencing, she said. The community appreciates your cooperation. Cooperation. I almost laughed. Instead, I slid my phone back into my pocket and looked once more at the lone concrete marker standing quietly behind the torn-up shoreline. Someone had gone to extraordinary effort to erase a boundary. They just hadn't erased all of it. And judging by the steady parade of trucks disappearing toward the marina, they hadn't realized what they were driving across to get there. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw cedar boards crashing into the dirt and another truck rolling across the same strip of gravel beside the lake. By sunrise, the morning air carried the familiar smell of wet pine and fresh water, but it couldn't hide the scent of fresh asphalt patching where heavy equipment had chewed up my shoreline. Laura stood beside me on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee, quietly watching another pickup pull toward the marina. "They started early," she said. "They never stopped." I grabbed my camera instead of my coffee. If Victoria wanted to turn my property into a construction zone, every minute of it was going into a file. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I walked the shoreline again. More dock sections had arrived overnight. Temporary fencing now blocked part of my own walking path. One contractor politely apologized before asking me to move because they were working inside the HOA project limits. I didn't argue. I simply photographed the orange fencing, the machinery, and every tire track crossing my grass before writing the exact time in a small field notebook I carried on engineering jobs. Habit. Measurements first. Opinions later. When I reached the mailbox, a certified envelope was waiting. Willow Cove Homeowners Association. That didn't surprise me. Opening it did. Inside was a formal board resolution declaring my lakeshore fence an unauthorized obstruction to common recreational property. According to the notice, the HOA had voted unanimously to remove it under emergency authority. The letter demanded that I reimburse the association for demolition costs if I attempted to interfere with construction. There was also a deadline. 7 days. After that, they would assess daily fines for obstructing community improvements. I read the letter twice. Then a third time. Laura stepped beside me. "They're billing you for tearing down your own fence." Apparently. She shook her head. This wasn't written overnight. She was right. Laura had spent 15 years as a CPA catching details most people skipped. The resolution carried a board approval date from nearly 3 weeks earlier. 3 weeks. While I was supervising a bridge inspection project in northern Idaho. They hadn't reacted to my fence. They'd planned around my absence. That realization settled in my stomach like cold lead. Back inside, we spread decades of paperwork across the dining room table. Dad believed in filing everything. Property tax receipts, survey invoices, engineering permits, old correspondence, even handwritten maintenance logs. The room smelled faintly of aging paper and cedar from the cabinets he'd built himself. Laura opened one folder after another. I found the shoreline stabilization permit. Good. Original dock approval. Keep it. She slid another document toward me. This one's interesting. It wasn't dramatic. Just an old easement agreement attached to several engineering drawings. I remembered Dad making me carry rolled-up blueprints when I was 16, complaining they were heavier than fishing gear. He'd laughed. Paper weighs less than lawsuits. At the time I thought he was joking. Now I wasn't so sure. I compared the engineering drawings with the HOA packet. Something felt off. Victoria's subdivision map looked professionally reproduced. Clean. Color-coded. Modern. But one thin strip near the marina entrance had been shaded differently than the rest of the common area. Almost like someone wanted your eyes to slide right past it. Before I could study it longer, another vehicle pulled into the driveway. White SUV. HOA logo. 2 board members climbed out carrying clipboards. Neither introduced themselves. One simply began taking photographs of my dock, while the other measured distances with a laser rangefinder. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Routine compliance inspection." I didn't request one. It isn't optional. They spent 20 minutes documenting my shoreline without stepping onto the construction area behind them. Not once. Every violation they recorded belonged to me. Every broken board caused by their contractors somehow escaped notice. When they finally drove away, I watched their SUV disappear down the gravel lane toward the marina. The same lane every delivery truck had used yesterday. The same lane Victoria seemed determined to treat as invisible. That was when it finally clicked. This wasn't one impulsive decision by an overconfident HOA president. The board, the contractors, the paperwork, the inspections, they were all working from the same plan. And somewhere inside that carefully coordinated plan was one piece that didn't fit. I spent the rest of that afternoon doing what I'd been trained to do on every engineering failure investigation I'd ever worked. I stopped assuming. I started measuring. The shoreline looked different when you ignored the arguments and focused on the facts. Boot prints, fresh gravel, new tire ruts, spray-painted utility marks. Every piece fit somewhere. I walked the entire length of the gravel lane with my camera hanging against my chest, taking overlapping photographs every 20 feet. my notebook filled with timestamps, distances, and license plate numbers from contractor trucks coming and going. Nobody stopped me. Not yet. At the Marina entrance, I stepped aside as a fuel truck rumbled past. The driver lowered his window. "You with the HOA?" "No." He shrugged. "They told us all deliveries come through here now." "Who told you?" "The Marina office." That was all he knew. Nothing suspicious in his voice. Just another man following directions. As soon as he disappeared toward the docks, I turned my attention back to the ground. Heavy trucks leave stories behind. Years of designing roads had taught me that. Fresh asphalt patches sat on top of older gravel repairs, but underneath both I could still see narrow drainage swales running along each side of the lane. Somebody had recently widened the driving surface without rebuilding the drainage. Temporary work. Fast work. The kind meant to support heavier traffic. I photographed every section. Back home, Laura already had my laptop open. I organized the camera files by time. I smiled. "Marry a CPA if you ever want evidence to stay organized." She pointed toward the screen. "You should look at yesterday's security footage again." I loaded the recordings from the camera mounted above our garage. Yesterday, I'd focused on the fence. This time I watched the trucks, frame by frame. At 7:14 a.m., the excavator arrived. At 7:27, Victoria's Range Rover entered. At 7:41, the first flatbed carrying dock sections rolled across the gravel lane. Then another. Then another. Every single vehicle followed exactly the same route. None entered from the subdivision streets. None approached from the Marina parking lot. Every commercial truck crossed that narrow strip beside my fence before reaching the construction site. Laura leaned closer. "They don't have another entrance." "I don't think they do." She replayed one clip. A concrete mixer backed awkwardly through the lane, barely clearing 2 mature oak trees before continuing toward the shoreline. "There isn't enough room for them to turn around anywhere else," she said. That bothered me. Not because it proved anything, because it raised a better question. Why would a marina expansion depend entirely on crossing land the HOA insisted belonged to them? The answer should have been obvious. Instead, it wasn't. The next morning, I drove to the county recorder's office. Small building, old brick. The smell of paper, toner, and worn carpet hit me the moment I walked inside. I requested every publicly recorded plat involving Willow Cove Marina and the surrounding subdivision. The clerk disappeared for nearly 20 minutes before returning with several oversized map books. "Everything's public," she said, "as long as you don't remove the originals." I spent hours comparing plats against the HOA resolution folded in my backpack. Some lines matched perfectly. Road widths, lot numbers, dock locations. Others didn't. One revised subdivision plat showed the common recreation area ending several feet short of the gravel lane. The HOA version extended cleanly across it using different shading. Same boundary line, different coloring. Easy to overlook. Hard to explain. I photographed both maps side by side using my phone. Just as I finished, a familiar perfume drifted through the records room. Expensive. Sharp. Victoria. She hadn't noticed me yet. She walked straight to the counter and quietly asked the clerk whether anyone had requested the Marina property files. The clerk looked uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, I can't discuss other visitors." Victoria smiled politely. "Of course." Then she turned. Our eyes met across the room. For the first time since this started, her smile disappeared. She hadn't expected to find me looking at county records. And somehow, that bothered her a lot more than my photographs ever had. Victoria recovered first. Her smile returned before she even reached the records counter, polished and effortless, like she'd rehearsed it in a mirror. "Ethan," she said warmly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Still trying to untangle old property maps? I like accurate maps. So do we." She nodded politely toward the clerk before walking out without another word. It should have felt like a harmless exchange. Instead, it felt like a warning. By the time I drove home, the warning had already turned into action. A bright orange notice had been zip-tied to my front gate. Notice of noncompliance. The HOA had suspended my access to all community amenities, imposed an immediate emergency assessment of $8,500 for construction delays, and scheduled a disciplinary hearing before the board 5 days later. At the bottom sat one sentence that caught my attention. "Failure to cooperate may result in legal action affecting property access." Property access. Not dues. Not landscaping. Access. Laura read the letter over my shoulder. They're changing the language. I noticed. They're not talking about rules anymore. No, they're talking about controlling movement. That evening, another surprise arrived. An email from Willow Cove HOA. Not just to me, to every homeowner in the subdivision. Laura found it first. Subject line. Community waterfront improvement update. Victoria described me as a neighboring property owner attempting to delay improvements benefiting hundreds of residents through frivolous ownership claims. There was no mention of my demolished fence. No mention of construction crossing my lawn. Only carefully selected photographs showing smiling families near the marina and computer renderings of expanded boat slips. By bedtime, neighborhood social media pages had already filled with comments. Some sympathetic. Most weren't. One called me the guy holding the entire lake hostage. Another suggested I was demanding money from the HOA. I closed the laptop. I don't need to read the rest. Laura reached over and squeezed my hand. They're winning the public conversation. For now. The next morning, I noticed something else. The construction fence had moved. Not away from my property. Farther onto it. An additional 30 feet of orange mesh now blocked my shoreline path. 2 temporary signs read. Authorized personnel. Only one contractor looked embarrassed when I approached. I'm just following the site plan. I know. He hesitated before lowering his voice. They told us not to discuss anything with you. Who did? The project manager. Before he could say another word, a white pickup bearing the Marina company's logo pulled into the site. The contractor immediately walked away. I didn't stop him. People protecting their jobs usually weren't protecting the truth. I photographed the relocated fencing from every angle. Then I stepped back far enough to include the gravel lane. Every delivery still entered through the same narrow corridor. Every truck, every trailer, every fuel shipment. Nothing had changed there, which made Victoria's obsession with pushing the construction fence deeper onto my property even stranger. She wanted more shoreline, but she never touched that lane. That afternoon, I made a decision Laura didn't immediately understand. Instead of removing the temporary fencing or confronting another crew, I installed 2 additional security cameras. One overlooking the damaged shoreline. The other aimed directly at the gravel lane from our boathouse roof. You think they'll damage something else? She asked. I think people act differently when they believe no one's watching. And if they notice the cameras? Then they'll know I'm documenting everything. The installation took most of the afternoon. As the sun dropped lower over the lake, I calibrated both cameras, synchronized their clocks with my existing system, and backed every recording to 2 separate hard drives inside the house. One copy stayed in my office. Laura locked the second inside our fireproof safe. Redundancy wasn't paranoia. It was standard engineering practice. Just before sunset, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered. A calm male voice spoke first. Mr. Caldwell, this is Owen Brooks with Willow Cove Marina. I recognized the name from the permit applications. I'd appreciate it if you'd stop photographing my employees. I'm photographing my property. A long pause. Then he sighed. I don't think you understand how much money is tied up in this expansion. I don't think you understand where your expansion is taking place. Another silence. When he finally spoke again, his tone had changed. County survey services will be on site Monday morning. For what? To establish the permanent project boundary. The line went dead. I stood there listening to the evening wind moving across the water. If that survey confirmed Victoria's version of the property line, crews wouldn't just be borrowing my shoreline anymore. They'd have an official map saying it had never belonged to me in the first place. Monday morning arrived wrapped in thick lake fog, the kind that muffles engines and turns every sound into an echo. I stood at the edge of my torn shoreline before sunrise, coffee cooling in one hand, camera hanging from my shoulder. Laura joined me without saying much. She didn't have to. We both heard the convoy before we saw it. 2 county SUVs, a survey truck, 3 contractor pickups, Victoria's white Range Rover. By 8 o'clock, half the neighborhood had gathered along the marina fence like they were waiting for a parade. Daniel Price stepped out of the lead county vehicle carrying a GPS rover and a stack of survey documents. His expression stayed professional, but when he recognized me, he gave the slightest nod. I'll need unrestricted access, he said. Victoria answered before I could. The HOA has already cleared the work area. Daniel looked at both of us. I'll determine where I need to work. That earned him a tight smile from Victoria. For the next 3 hours, I watched him move slowly across the shoreline, stopping where my fence had once stood. Again and again. Each time he frowned at the GPS screen. Each time one of his assistants searched for a monument that wasn't there. I knew exactly what they were looking for. The missing boundary markers. By noon, the crowd had grown. People whispered while phones recorded everything. Victoria stood confidently beside Owen Brooks, pointing toward the floating docks as though the outcome had already been decided. Finally, Daniel walked toward us. The visible monuments referenced by the current subdivision survey cannot be located. Victoria folded her arms. So, he glanced at his paperwork. Based on the available evidence. He paused, clearly choosing his words carefully. The preliminary field position favors the recorded subdivision plat. For a moment, nobody moved. Then applause broke out behind the Marina fence. Not loud, just enough. Victoria smiled as if she'd won an election. I appreciate the county confirming what we've known all along. I didn't answer, because technically, Daniel hadn't confirmed ownership. He'd confirmed what could be measured with the evidence still visible. Those were two very different things. Nobody else seemed to notice. By mid-afternoon, the consequences came fast. The contractor extended permanent construction, fencing another 40 feet. Fresh posts went into the ground where my shoreline path had been that morning. Workers began setting steel piles for additional dock slips. One excavator rolled directly over the flower bed Laura had planted beside the old cedar fence. The grinding sound of steel tracks crushing stone made her quietly turn away. I reached for her hand. She squeezed mine once. Hard. Then let go before anyone could see. A sheriff's deputy arrived just before 4. Professional. Respectful. He handed me a written notice explaining that, until ownership questions were resolved, interfering with the active construction area could expose me to trespassing charges because the project was proceeding under county-recognized survey control. It felt surreal. Standing on land my father had spent his life protecting, being warned to stay away from it. That evening, the local newspaper posted an online article. County survey supports HOA Marina expansion. There was my house in the background. There was Victoria smiling beside the survey crew. There wasn't a single photograph of the demolished fence, or the destroyed landscaping, or the trucks crossing my property. Laura quietly closed the laptop. They've made you look like the unreasonable one. I know. For the first time since this started, I honestly wondered whether I'd underestimated them. Maybe I'd spent too much time documenting while they spent theirs building a story everyone wanted to believe. The sun was setting when I walked back down to the shoreline alone. The fresh survey stakes stood in a straight line across the dirt. Bright orange ribbon fluttered in the breeze. I crouched where one of Daniel's assistants had worked for nearly 10 minutes that morning. The soil was still loose, recently disturbed. At first I thought it was just another hole left by construction. Then I noticed something different. The dirt wasn't freshly dug. It had been freshly filled. The color changed in a nearly perfect circle about 8 inches wide. Someone had excavated something and carefully packed the earth back afterward. I looked toward the spot where the missing monument should have been, then back at the filled hole. Daniel hadn't failed to find a boundary marker. Someone had made sure there wasn't one left to find. I knelt beside the filled hole until the last strip of orange sunlight disappeared behind the trees. Fresh soil settles differently. Years of inspecting bridge foundations had taught me that. Compacted earth leaves subtle rings when moisture evaporates. Undisturbed ground doesn't. This wasn't natural settling. Someone had dug a precise cylinder, removed whatever had been inside, and carefully packed the dirt back. I took photographs from every angle with a measuring scale beside the hole, then switched to the camera mounted on my tripod. Wide shots first, close-up second, GPS coordinates last. Nothing touched the ground. Nothing moved. Evidence is worth exactly one mistake. Back inside, Laura already had the dining room table covered with county maps, engineering drawings, and Dad's old project binders. You found something. I found where something used to be. She looked at the photographs without speaking. Then she reached for one of Frank Caldwell's engineering notebooks. The leather cover had faded almost gray from years of use. Dad never wrote elegant notes. Just dates, measurements, coordinates. Enough to let another engineer reconstruct his work decades later. Laura stopped halfway through the notebook. Ethan. She slid it toward me. A hand-drawn shoreline sketch filled the page. Beside one corner, Dad had written, "Permanent control monument installed. Do not disturb. Reference for future shoreline certification. Below it sat 4 coordinate measurements. I looked back at the photograph on my camera, then at the notebook. The dimensions matched. Almost exactly. My pulse stayed calm. That was the difference between hope and engineering. Hope guesses. Measurements verify. The next morning I called Daniel Price. "I'd like to show you something." He hesitated. "The preliminary survey has already been submitted. I'm not asking you to change it." Another pause. "What did you find?" "A location." He arrived just after lunch wearing the same county vest from Monday. No entourage. No contractors. No HOA board. Just Daniel carrying a field tablet and a metal probe. I never told him what I expected. Only handed him Dad's notebook. He studied the page for nearly a minute before walking directly toward the filled hole. Without saying anything, he pushed the probe into the soil. It sank easily. Again. Then, clink. A dull metallic sound. Not deep. Less than a foot below the surface. Daniel stopped immediately. He looked at me. "You didn't dig." "No." "Good." He marked the location with a survey flag instead. "If that's what I think it is, nobody should touch it until it's documented." He photographed everything himself before comparing the coordinates inside Dad's notebook with the county GIS records on his tablet. His expression changed. "The monument appears on the original shoreline control survey. What about the subdivision plat? It references this control point. But the point is currently listed as destroyed." I looked toward the marina. "I don't think it destroyed itself." Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. Before leaving, he quietly exported the GPS log from his tablet and emailed me the public coordinate record. Nothing confidential. Nothing improper. Just the official record showing a permanent monument once existed exactly where someone had recently disturbed the soil. That afternoon, Laura organized everything into chronological folders. Photographs, security footage, county maps, engineering notes, camera timestamps, the notebook, Daniel's coordinate confirmation. Every file existed in 3 places before sunset. My office computer, an encrypted external drive, the fireproof safe. I spent the evening watching the security footage again. Not the fence, not the shoreline, the gravel lane. Truck after truck crossed it. Fuel deliveries, concrete mixers, utility crews. Every commercial vehicle entered through exactly the same narrow corridor. The corridor sitting beside the missing monument. The same corridor Dad's notebook referenced on the engineering sketch. I finally understood why Victoria never tried rerouting construction. She believed that lane belonged to the HOA as completely as the shoreline. She had built her entire expansion around that assumption. Just after 8 the next morning, I mailed a certified request to the county recorder asking for every original easement, amendment, and recorded maintenance agreement affecting the Marina access corridor dating back to my father's shoreline project. I wasn't trying to prove ownership anymore. I wanted to know exactly what everyone else had overlooked. The certified request reached the county recorder's office the following morning. By noon, my phone rang. "Mr. Caldwell?" the clerk asked. "Your request covers every recorded easement associated with the Marina access corridor since 1988. "That's correct. It'll take a little longer than normal." "I'll wait." "I think you should." The way she said it wasn't dramatic. Just careful, as though she'd found more paperwork than she expected. I thanked her and hung up. 2 hours later, another certified envelope arrived. This one wasn't from the county. It came from Willow Cove HOA. Notice of disciplinary hearing, mandatory attendance. Failure to appear would be treated as acceptance of all board findings. Laura looked at the date. Tomorrow night. They're moving fast. They're trying to finish this before something changes. That matched my own thinking. People only rush paperwork when they believe time is no longer on their side. The clubhouse smelled like fresh paint and burnt coffee when we walked in the next evening. Nearly every chair was occupied. Residents filled the back rows. Some genuinely curious. Others already convinced I was the man delaying their marina. Victoria sat at the center table beneath the HOA seal with 4 board members beside her. A digital recorder sat in plain view. Good. Official meetings create official records. I signed the attendance sheet. Victoria watched me carefully. "I'm glad you decided to cooperate. I wouldn't miss it." She smiled for the audience. "We'll begin." For nearly 40 minutes, she controlled the room. PowerPoint slides, construction schedules, budget summaries, artist renderings of the expanded marina. Every delay, every extra expense, Every contractor rescheduling was placed beside my name. Then came the vote. The board finds Mr. Caldwell responsible for obstructing a duly authorized community improvement. Her hands rose immediately. Victoria looked toward me. Would you like to respond before penalties are finalized? I stood slowly. I'm not here to argue. A few people exchanged puzzled looks. I'm here to ask one question. Victoria folded her hands. Go ahead. Did the board authorize removal of every boundary improvement located along my shoreline? Yes. Were survey monuments included? Her smile never changed. The construction contractor removed everything necessary to complete the approved project. So your answer is yes? Yes. One board member shifted uncomfortably. Victoria didn't notice. I continued. And those removals were approved by formal board vote. They were. Recorded in the official minutes? Of course. The room stayed quiet. Nobody understood why I cared about concrete markers instead of fences. Neither did Victoria. She looked almost amused. If you're trying to save a few broken pieces of concrete, Mr. Caldwell, I think your priorities are misplaced. I appreciate the clarification. I sat down. That was all. Victoria blinked. That's your entire statement. Yes. She looked disappointed. She'd expected a speech, an argument, maybe even an angry outburst. Instead, she resumed the meeting. The board therefore approves emergency assessments totaling $12,300. Another vote. Another unanimous approval. The recorder captured every word. The secretary typed every motion into the meeting minutes. When the hearing adjourned, residents filed toward the parking lot discussing dock slips and boat launches. Victoria caught up with me outside. You know, she said quietly, this would have been much easier if you'd accepted the survey. I did accept it. She frowned. The preliminary survey showed exactly what it was designed to show. For the first time all evening, uncertainty crossed her face. What does that mean? I smiled politely. I guess we'll both find out. She watched me walk away without another word. Back in my truck, Laura closed the passenger door and looked at me. You got what you wanted. I did. The recorder? The meeting minutes. She nodded. They admitted it themselves. Not ownership. Not yet. Something much more precise. The board had voluntarily placed on an official recording that they knowingly authorized the removal of every boundary improvement along my shoreline. No rumors. No assumptions. No anonymous witnesses. Their own votes. Their own signatures. Their own words. As I pulled onto the gravel road, my phone chimed with a new email from the county recorder. Requested documents are ready for pickup. At that moment, neither side could quietly walk away anymore. The county recorder's office opened at 8. Laura and I were waiting when the doors unlocked. The clerk disappeared into the archives and returned carrying a thick accordion file secured with a red ribbon. I think you'll want to look at these in order, she said. Inside were exactly what I'd requested. The original 1988 Marina access easement. Every recorded amendment. Every maintenance agreement. Every survey revision filed over the next 36 years. Nothing dramatic. Just paper. The kind that quietly outlives people. I spread the documents across one of the reading tables and started where Dad always taught me to start. With the oldest record. The first easement granted limited access across our property so Marina traffic could reach the docks. In exchange, the Marina agreed to preserve every permanent survey monument and boundary improvement defining the corridor. Failure to do so constituted material interference with the easement. I turned another page. Then another. Every amendment referenced the same permanent control monument. The same one Daniel had located beneath the freshly filled soil. The same one Victoria's board had admitted authorizing contractors to remove. Laura looked up from the next document. Ethan. She tapped one paragraph. The easement doesn't transfer ownership. I know. It only grants access. And only while its conditions are honored. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Everything finally fit. The lane. The concrete post, Dad's notebook, the missing monument, the board vote, the trucks. The Marina had never depended on owning my shoreline. It depended on crossing my property. And the HOA had just admitted, on the record, to violating the very agreement that allowed them to do it. By noon, we were sitting in Judge Harold Benson's courtroom for the emergency hearing the HOA had requested after I challenged the preliminary survey. Victoria looked confident. Owen Brooks sat beside her. Daniel Price occupied the witness bench with a survey file resting neatly in front of him. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. Judge Benson adjusted his glasses. "Mr. Price, have you completed your review?" "Yes, Your Honor." "What did you find?" Daniel remained as careful as he'd been from the beginning. The preliminary survey relied on visible monuments because one permanent control monument was missing. And now, we verified the original monument location using historical engineering coordinates, county GIS records, and the surviving inland reference monument. He looked toward me briefly. The disturbed soil identified during the preliminary survey corresponded precisely with the recorded control point. Victoria rose immediately. "Your Honor, that doesn't change ownership." Daniel didn't argue. "It changes the reliability of the preliminary field position." Judge Benson nodded. "Continue." Daniel placed two enlarged maps on the evidence stand. One was the subdivision plat. The other was the original easement drawing. Colored lines crossed the same narrow strip beside the marina entrance. "The HOA recreation area ends here," Daniel said, pointing with a wooden pointer. "The marina access easement begins here." He moved the pointer slightly. "It crosses Mr. Caldwell's property." The room fell silent. Victoria stepped forward. "Even if that's correct, the marina has used that entrance for decades." Judge Benson looked toward me. My attorney slid one document onto the evidence table. The certified HOA meeting minutes from the previous evening. Then another. The digital recording transcript. Judge Benson read quietly for nearly a minute. "The board authorized removal of every boundary improvement located along Mr. Caldwell's shoreline," he read aloud. Victoria's confidence cracked for the first time. Those comments referred to the fence. I remained standing. "Would you like the recording played?" She didn't answer. Judge Benson looked back toward Daniel. "Mr. Price, were permanent survey monuments boundary improvements?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Were they referenced in the recorded easement?" "They were." "And if they were intentionally removed?" Daniel chose each word carefully. "That would constitute interference with the recorded boundary infrastructure supporting the easement." Victoria tried once more. "We relied on our contractor." Judge Benson shook his head. "Your board didn't merely rely on a contractor." He lifted the certified minutes. "You voted." The courtroom grew impossibly quiet. Judge Benson set both documents on the bench. "Pending final adjudication, the court finds sufficient evidence that the existing marina access easement may have been materially breached." He picked up his pen. "The HOA is hereby ordered to cease all expansion activity immediately." Victoria opened her mouth to object. The judge continued before she could speak. "Furthermore, the court authorizes restoration of the verified legal boundary pending final judgment." The sound of his signature echoed louder in my mind than any excavator ever had. For the first time since my fence came down, the machinery outside the courthouse would have to stop. The court order reached the construction site before noon. By the time I drove back to the lake, the sounds that had haunted me for nearly 2 weeks were gone. No excavators. No backup alarms. No diesel engines idling beside the shoreline. Only wind moving through the pines and small waves tapping against the docks. Yellow caution tape stretched across the unfinished marina expansion. County inspectors stood beside the equipment recording serial numbers while contractors quietly loaded tools back onto trailers. Nobody argued. There wasn't much left to argue about. Daniel Price was supervising the restoration survey himself. This time there were no missing monuments. A licensed excavation crew carefully removed the packed soil while Daniel documented every step with photographs and GPS equipment. Less than a foot below the surface, the steel control monument emerged exactly where Dad's notebook said it would. Rust-stained, scratched, still anchored in concrete, still exactly where it had been installed decades earlier. Daniel looked over at me. It never moved. No, it was buried. He nodded once before photographing it again. The record spoke for itself. Within days, the court entered its final order. The HOA remained responsible for destroying surveyed boundary improvements, interfering with the recorded easement, and authorizing construction beyond its legal authority. Their insurer refused coverage after determining the damage resulted from intentional board decisions rather than an accident. The repair bills became the HOA's responsibility. Fence reconstruction, survey costs, engineering expenses, shoreline restoration, landscaping, legal fees, everything. Victoria Ashcroft resigned before the following month's board meeting. There was no dramatic speech, no angry confrontation, just a short written statement announcing personal reasons. Owen Brooks wasn't treated like a villain. The Marina management had relied on the HOA's representations, and the court recognized that distinction. A few weeks later, he asked if I'd meet him beside the gravel lane. I should have questioned the paperwork sooner, he admitted. So should a lot of people. He looked toward the entrance. We still need access. I know. The easement had never been the problem. Ignoring it had. After several meetings, we negotiated a new commercial access agreement. Everything was documented. Independent annual surveys, permanent monument inspections, mandatory notification before construction, clear maintenance responsibilities. Every condition written plainly enough that no future board could pretend not to understand it. The marina reopened several weeks later. Smaller than Victoria's expansion had promised. Legally built, properly accessed. The community accepted it with surprising speed. Some neighbors apologized. Others simply started waving again when they drove past. That was enough. One Saturday morning, Laura and I unloaded a stack of fresh cedar boards from my truck. The smell instantly carried me back to the day Dad and I built the original fence. Resin, sawdust, warm summer air drifting off the lake. We rebuilt it along the restored survey line under Daniel's final measurements. Every post sat exactly where it belonged. When we reached the narrow gravel lane leading toward the marina, I stopped for a moment. The new fence ended precisely at the access corridor. No farther, no closer. Beside it stood a steel gate. Simple, solid, locked only when it needed to be. Commercial deliveries now checked in before crossing, just like the agreement required. Control had returned without taking away what the law still allowed. Laura smiled as she brushed cedar dust from her hands. Your dad would have approved. I looked toward the lone concrete reference post that had survived everything. The weathered marker still stood quietly behind the ornamental grass where almost nobody noticed it. Almost. I noticed. I always would. The evening sun settled low across the water, turning the rebuilt fence gold. A Marina truck rolled slowly through the gate after the driver signed the access log, its tires crunching over the same gravel lane I'd watched so carefully from the beginning. The sound was different now, not because the road had changed, because the boundary had finally been respected. Justice hadn't arrived with shouting or revenge. It arrived with measurements, records, patience, and one fence rebuilt exactly where it had always belonged.